Good afternoon and a very warm virtual welcome to everyone on the Cloud Chapter's first webinar. My name is Raju. I'm Honorary Vice President of the SCS Cloud Chapter and I'm honored to moderate this online panel discussion. Before we start, I need to inform all viewers that this webinar will be recorded and that by participating in this webinar, you consent to the recording and its reproduction to be used for webcasts and or promotional purposes by SCS and or its representatives deem fit for its use. Moreover, the event does not allow for unauthorized recording by any third party. By attending the event, you agree not to record or digitize any part of this presentation. That out of the way, it is now my pleasure to invite Dr. Anton Ravindran, Honorary President of the SCS Cloud Chapter, for his opening remarks. Dr. Anton, please.
Thank you, Raju. And more importantly, thank you all for joining us today. To start this session, let me take a few minutes to explore the impact of cloud computing during this pandemic. Of course, I'll leave it to the panelists to expand on the bits and bytes of it. This is a critical moment, unrivaled in our lifetime. For a moment, let us imagine a world without cloud computing. Here we are. We have gone online without any advance notice and at a speed unprecedented in recent memory. The entire world has converted personal and physical interactions to virtual ones. Majority of companies globally, even in remote locations, have been able to continue to operate. Collaboration, conferencing, and digital workplace tools have been pressed into urgent COVID-19 usage by governments, businesses, educational institutions, and by each one of us. Zoom, Slack, Blackboard, Microsoft Teams, WebEx, Google Classroom, Hangouts, Moodle, to name a few, have been at the center of this. The point is, they all typically run on public cloud infrastructure. As you would have seen and heard from the local news in the past few days, telehealth and telemedicine have received the much needed kickstart. In the frantic scientific search for vaccines, treatments, and testing, we rely on compute time from our cloud service providers. Without the cloud, trading applications, stock markets could not operate in real time in the midst of this. Though much more can be said, I will not bore you with details given that we have limited time. Besides, I'll leave it to the panel. But in short, in sum, scalability, elasticity, pay-per-use, distribution across zones and regions, the key value proposition of cloud is really being fully leveraged. The notion of being able to scale up at a moment's notice is on full display. Not just public cloud infrastructure as a service, but this crisis has been also a test for no other of the ability of online applications to dynamically scale, a remarkable feat only possible because of public cloud and related technologies. Now, let me quickly touch on the challenges and limitations before I conclude. Firstly, is it real? And secondly, how serious is it? Performance. During this pandemic, to say internet and World Wide Web are being tested is an understatement. However, so far, this unprecedented shift from physical world to virtual has performed without any major glitch and has weathered the stress test. Microsoft reports nearly 800% spike in cloud services demand. The order of magnitude of demand surge is unrivaled, and please remember, we expect something like 99.99% uptime availability. It is difficult to conceive of the scale of these data centers, with AWS alone operating over 70 compute zones around the world, where workloads can be dynamically reassigned. Same applies to MS, Google, and the others. Given this, naturally, some service degradation may be inevitable. However, It is more to do with where the end users tries to access the cloud, or in other words, last mile access related issues, rather than the cloud itself. Further, cloud technology is advancing, as we know, and fog computing, edge computing, and other technologies will be able to mitigate these challenges going forward. Another issue that is foremost on the minds of all of us is security and privacy. During this crisis, secure cloud architectures are now essential not only for mission critical applications, but for schools and home users. In other words, for everyone. Major cloud providers are today using AI, deep learning to improve detection capabilities. Google reports that they can scan over 300 billion attachments for malware every week and blocks more than 100 million phishing emails because of ML and AI. And these models have evolved to understand and filter these threats. And most of the major service providers are able to block more than 99% malware attacks. Lastly, technical literacy, cloud literacy. Firstly, many end users lack the experience on basic technical know-how to handle their personal cyber infrastructure. This is also the cause for some of the reported security breaches. Now, from a business and application development perspective, the crisis has increased the need to manage rapid change by several orders of magnitude. This requires continuous integration and continuous delivery, CI/CD capabilities. Besides, legacy vertical industry apps will need to be rewritten for PaaS or SaaS by leveraging from technologies such as containerization and microservices. Hence, technical skills are required in these areas, including DevOps, microservices, SaaS, RAD, cloud security, machine learning, to name a few. Let me conclude by posing the question: what are the long-term effects of this sudden mass discovery of cloud-based collaboration? To me, the answer is obvious. The convergence of online and physical world in all facets of life and work has been fast-forwarded by several orders of magnitude. Now it's time for us to begin to think about post-COVID-19 cloud. To end, imagine if the cloud had never happened. Without the cloud, we couldn't do many of the things, or most of the things we do today, including this session. On that note, let me once again thank Raju for moderating this session, the co-office bearers for being on the panel, Mr. Ramesh from NTUC being on the panel, and particularly the audience online. Let me pass the virtual flow back to Raju on this note.
Thank you, Dr. Anton. Our topic of discussion today is how best to respond to COVID-19 by leveraging cloud. How can you continue your work and business using cloud platforms? What are some of the tips to handle security and latency? How to best leverage cloud during COVID-19? We have assembled a panel of experts to answer these questions, as well as some of your own questions today. So let me introduce the panel to you right away, starting with a cloud user, NTUC Enterprise, Mr. Ramesh. Mr. Ramesh, please, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Chief Information Officer for the NTUC Enterprise. I think everyone is pretty familiar with what we do. We have about 10 social enterprises, and I am responsible overall for the technology portion for that.
Thank you, Mr. Ramesh. Next, let's get in from a top consultancy, Accenture, Mr. Sandeep.
Thanks, Raju. Good afternoon, everyone. Excited to be on this panel. My name is Sandeep Gupta. I am one of the managing directors in the Singapore office, responsible for the Google Cloud business and practice across Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Look forward to views and comments during the discussion.
Thank you, Sandeep. Next, let's hear from our largest telco, Singtel, Mr. Lok.
Thanks, Raju. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yu Ying, Secretary of the SES Cloud Chapter, and I take care of the enterprise market from Singtel Group. I cover in particular two important growth areas, cloud and cybersecurity across the enterprise market. Honored to be here to share our experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lok. And now from a Googler, Mr. Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Raju. Afternoon, everyone. Brian from the Google team here. And I lead the Singapore Enterprises business for Google, but I'm also very keen to share, of course, what we've experienced from the cloud perspective today, but also what we've seen a lot from our advertising, our Google Maps, and our other business units. So looking forward.
Thank you, Brian. And last but not least, from Big Blue, IBM, Mr. Guna.
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm Guna. I'm the Vice President of the Cloud Chapter. And my day job is actually I'm the General Manager for IBM Cloud, which is basically our cloud business and our software business. So my day job, I work with many of my customers in terms of helping them, whether it's because of the COVID or even before, helping them transition or move their platforms to a cloud, helping them with both the software pieces of it, the services piece of it, and of course the security piece of it. Looking forward to sharing some tips and understanding more from the group as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Guna. There we have 6 experts ready to offer their views on how best to leverage the cloud during COVID-19. So let's start with the first question with end users. Almost everyone is currently at home and forced to work online, with most apps being on cloud. Are end user organizations equipped with cloud-enabled applications for their workforce? That's a question that bothers many people working from home. Let's check with a large end user organization, NTUC Enterprise. Mr. Ramesh, please.
Sure. I think COVID-19 has certainly accelerated the cloud adoption and broken several barriers, such as people had with working remotely. As you know, Singapore in general was never known for working virtually and working from home. So for a number of people, it's a novel experience, and they're faced with physical constraints as well as with mindset changes that we need to go through. So what we were trying to do just before COVID was we were trying to roll out a collaboration software called G Suite, Google Suite, across NTUC, and we've been doing it in a phased rollout. So when COVID hit, there were obviously some teething issues initially to make sure that people knew how to even log into a virtual meeting, how to work remotely, how to collaborate remotely, and so forth. And since then, what we have done is we've been able to open up certain aspects of G Suite, such as the chat, the conference calling, etc., to everyone. And now we suddenly have, after a few weeks of COVID and working from home, we have resident experts now and champions of how virtual collaboration works. It is not, I think it's not perfect. Technology has not completely taken over, especially in areas such as it doesn't supplement or doesn't replace having whiteboard discussions when you're doing large design sessions. But for conferences like these and for other basic work, I think we've really seen a dramatic shift in terms of how COVID has accelerated cloud adoption.
Thank you, Ramesh. Next, I'd like the views from a consultant who works with end users, Accenture. Mr. Sandeep.
Yeah, so Accenture has about 500,000 plus employees globally. And we generally, 60 to 70% of our employees work in a hoteling way, where we are used to working remotely, using a laptop and a headset most of the time. But even for folks like us, we were challenged towards the end, where 20% of the employees who are working from the offices, we need to mobilize them. And as much as what Ramesh mentioned about technology, I think the bigger issue that I think we have to deal with as enterprises is to train these users to be able to do that at scale. So having to deal with that particular situation, I think we had to set up training sessions for all of our users to how to use these cloud-based remote systems. I think that is one thing I would suggest to people who have to deal with this, is to make sure that training becomes one key part of the agenda as you roll out your cloud-based remote working environment, because it's literally transformation of your people resources, and for them to be able to be ready for using this cloud-based environments.
Thank you, Sandeep. Yes, trading is the most pertinent thing, and thanks that you brought it up. But the number one concern about cloud during normal times was security. The number one concern about cloud now is also security. After hacking incidents on Zoom, the paranoia has increased. I'd like to know what your views and your advice are for end users. Let me get views from two large organizations who would know more about security on the cloud, IBM and Singtel. First, IBM, Mr. Guna.
Thanks, Raju. A lot of the discussion around cloud and cloud security has always been around the platform security. Is my data safe? Can I move my environment to the cloud? And if I move things to the cloud, then how good is the security in there from my environment perspective, that my data, my software, all of my assets are protected? But if you really look at it from the last couple of years, a lot of work actually has been done on public cloud, and public cloud or cloud in general has become a much more secure platform. And especially in Singapore, we do have local standards like NTCS. There are also global standards like SOC that actually ensure that a cloud provider, a public cloud provider, is actually more secure, and probably in all essence more secure than your own on-premise data center. But if you look at all of the incidents recently, or specifically that Zoom incident, it all comes down to how you actually manage the user. So yes, there are proper key discipline and rules required. For example, even Zoom, we are using Zoom as a platform now. But if you really look at it, having the basic discipline of having security, passwords, access, etc. are critical. So at this point in time now, in terms of security, what is probably more important is actually around the security of the device. So if I have a laptop, a PC, or a mobile phone accessing my network or my cloud environment, how secure is that environment? Not only is my user discipline on not clicking on phishing emails, for example, or not compromising the devices, but I need to secure the end device. And two, I need to make sure that the person who's logging on via that mobile device is my employee or a person that I've actually given access rights to. So the whole concept of managing the identity of the person, who's the person who's given the access, and am I controlling or managing the security of the end device? So all of those actually become a lot more critical. Even implementing things like two-factor authentication, single sign-on, or those become really critical in how you actually manage the security in a cloud environment, especially now when you've moved everything to remote, literally overnight. Raju?
Thank you, Guna. Mr. Lop, Singtel, do you agree?
Thanks, Raju. In fact, I do agree, and let me substantiate on what Guna has mentioned. You know, Zoom specifically got popular because it's easy to use and deploy. With that, it will come with vulnerabilities due to users' behavior or pattern. For example, do we use a password for meeting? Do we place people in waiting room, authenticate before letting them in? Convenience versus security. Granted, there's argument on Zoom, end-to-end encryption, but it's primarily secure. It's up to us, like what Guna has mentioned, add layer of security on top of our devices. Let me give you an extreme example. We see some of the banks dealing with capital markets. Due to COVID, has accelerated bringing trading rooms to home. It's not new, but it has been accelerating. They also leverage and adopt native cloud-based communication. These are those that allows you for the traditional hood and hauler where they trade across the globe. And it includes analytics platform as well. So it's seamless trading at home for traders, no longer reliant on traditional dealer bots network. Mind you, these are secure transactions, but they still adopt cloud-based communications. Of course, some resources are used to improve security posture. It can be done, and this is a classic example of the virus being a catalyst to overhaul the mindsets of Wall Street or closer to home, Singapore Stock Exchange. So to the end users, go ahead on proven cloud solutions, but ensure a few things, right? As Guna has touched on, enterprises would have some form of secure access strategy, your VPN, your VDIs, endpoint protection to secure the devices out there. But don't forget, yeah, hackers love to attack the weakest link, which are the remote users, or should I say human behavior, right? We at Singtel has a TrustWave Spider Lab email threat research team. The team has observed a major spike in COVID-19 team phishing emails. So alert your users on these phishing campaigns, remind your staff not to connect through public Wi-Fi for work, and remember this, change their default router password at home, right? Last but not least, enable multi-factor authentication. These are some of the actionable steps. Thank you. Back to you, Raju.
It was interesting that you brought up the infrastructure side. So that ties up to my next question. Can companies build resilient apps on cloud? How do companies manage business continuity in disaster recovery? I'm going to put this question to two large organizations who specialize in this, Accenture and Google. First, Accenture. Mr. Sandeep.
Sure, Raju. Thank you. I think if you look at what happened when COVID struck, right, a lot of the different aspects of a business got challenged. One is in the area of customer care. Second is in the area of people not buying on the street, but buying over online channels. The supply chain where you were supposed to get your goods or services from, that didn't exist anymore. So, but all of this, enterprises had to align themselves to serve the customer or the end user, and the infrastructure had to play a key part in this, because there were certainly surges in regions or areas of the geography. There are surges in the area of applications that the end customer and the user were using. Now you had to be prepared for all of those surges, both from an application perspective, network perspective, security perspective, and cloud, for those reasons, very handy. Companies and enterprises who were ready with on cloud, even they faced the problem. But think of companies that were not on cloud. They literally had to think of accelerating their journey to cloud overnight. And for that reason, they had to think about, how do you handle customer care? How do you bring in data and machine learning and AI to proactively support your customers? How do you make sure that if your systems were bursting, how do you bring that load into the cloud? Or if you didn't have backup in DR, how do you suddenly enable that using cloud? So these are examples of how companies use cloud in the very short period of time to balance what they require to continue their business, and continue their business from different channels and different geographies that they didn't anticipate from.
Thank you, Sandeep. It was a very deep insight. I want to next ask our expert Googler, Mr. Brian.
Thanks, Raju. So, adding on to, I guess, what Sandeep mentioned, definitely in terms of building resilient apps on the cloud, I think, yes, absolutely. In fact, maybe, where the Google team generally comes from is really to challenge our partners and our customers to say, why not? You should absolutely always be building resilient apps instead of like a single instance, a single deployment without, business continuity or a DR plan. I think where I can come from, though, to add on is generally when Google thinks about building such kinds of applications, I think you can really think about it from two perspectives. The first perspective is really about, what you can do with your existing providers, your existing technologies, your existing cloud to build a resilient solution. Dr. Anton sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but, Google itself is actually a really interesting example because, Google.com through this COVID situation is, indeed handling that massive surge. And we're handling that massive surge with our own technology, with our own infrastructure, with our existing data center footprint, right? So we had to build our technology and we had to build our applications with what we had in mind to serve these kinds of surges, whether that means using multiple zones, using multiple data centers in Singapore, outside of Singapore. These are all considerations which you can consider in building these kinds of BC and DR applications. I think the other way, though, of looking at it, and of course, many organizations have opted for these routes, is to consider a multi-cloud approach, right? Using alternative providers or using alternative technologies so that you have that BC or DR plan in place. One add-on though that I can put forth there, whether it's using Google, whether it's using Amazon, Ali, Azure, XYZ, you name it, is that there actually are indeed tools or capabilities that do help organizations to manage that sort of multi-cloud world. There's many tools. Let me just throw out sort of one name out there to potentially help some of our audience here. But what I've personally seen is that many enterprise organizations who have decided on a multi-cloud strategy may use a tool like Terraform, which does allow them to essentially build a single template that is deployable across multiple clouds, that does work across multiple clouds. And so again, if you are decided on a multi-cloud approach for your business continuity, for your disaster recovery strategy, there are many tools that will allow you to work in the multi-cloud world, but hopefully without the complexity of learning, two totally different clouds at the same time.
Thanks for getting a broad sweep of the answer, Brian. That brings me to an issue that bothers everybody, outages or non-availability. Just last week, many of us suffered due to outages at StarHub. My question is, how can companies deal with such issues beyond their control, especially during these times? Let's get expert views from a telco first and later from Google. First, Singtel, Mr. Lok.
Thanks, Raju. No negative marketing from my part. It was indeed an unfortunate incident. The most important thing is definitely ensure diversity within your network. Most enterprises have done that with the selection of cloud providers. For those at home, have an alternative broadband, but it may be too costly. Or alternatively, you really could get an alternate mobile broadband from a different provider for contingency. Currently, during COVID-19, there are short-term, low-cost contracts out there for mobile broadband. It's between 1 to 3 months. So do check them out. But again, I don't suggest your staff to hunt for public Wi-Fi, right? So back to you, Raju.
Thank you. That was quick. Does Google have any mitigation ideas, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I'll just sort of quickly add on to where Lok was coming from. But I think funnily enough, I can use sort of the same structure that I mentioned earlier, which is number one, what can you do with, again, your existing technology, your existing router, so on and so forth, as well as what you could do from an alternative provider standpoint, right? So whether you have StarHub and then you also want a backup plan, so to speak, with Singtel, so on and so forth. Let me tackle the first one. I think funnily enough, Google's experience with organizations or even with individuals is that even within sort of a single provider setup, what we have seen is I think sometimes the amount of knowledge that there is out there that indeed your single provider has these backup capabilities, whether, for example, you have a broadband connection or you have a lease line for a small enterprise. There are actually many options within single providers to have backup capabilities configured, whether that is if you're, for example, you're using a lease line connection and then you have an internet VPN set up in case of failover scenarios, so on and so forth. There are actually, again, many technologies available. Have a chat with your existing providers, have a chat with, some of the IT specialists that because again, there are many capabilities which are actually there, but are potentially not being used. Right? On sort of the multi-cloud side or more from an alternative provider standpoint, I think absolutely. Just to share with you where, our experience has seen this work is that for many, organizations or enterprises in certain cases who, to use a very local term, are a little bit yasu about a situation where, a StarHub line, XYZ line does go down, what they will do is that they will indeed have a backup strategy in place so that, again, if that primary primary line goes down, they have an alternative line from a totally different provider. I think generally this is going to depend on the industry that you are in. Like, can you survive with 1 hour of downtime, 2 hours of downtime? Can you survive with a degraded performance on a mobile connection versus a broadband connection? These are all things to consider, but definitely, you know, my piece of advice would be see what you can do with your existing providers first, because it could be capabilities that you have and you're just not using. And then if you really need, so if you are in the financial services, if you are in the legal space, then absolutely do consider those, you know, alternative providers if your business does require that level of service level agreement, if you will.
Thank you. Excellent responses, gentlemen. The big elephant in the room, as everybody knows, is COVID-19. So my next question is, how is this pandemic forcing companies to accelerate digital transformation? And what role is cloud playing in this? I'd like views from a big consultancy first and later from a large end user. First, Accenture, Mr. Sandeep.
Yeah, I think the term digital transformation has been floating around for multiple years, and it is not purely around technology. It's also about how you evolve your business. And companies that have taken the benefit of newer technologies like cloud have shown better stakeholder returns as well as profits compared to the companies that haven't. What that means is, in situations like this, many CXOs have realized that if they were on this path and if they were already transformed their infrastructure or their applications to support digital transformation, maybe they would have faced less of the problem with COVID-19 compared to if they were not. What that means is we've seen a lot of our customers accelerate the pace of transformation. The things that they were thinking of doing 6 months to a year later, they had to convince their management to accelerate and sign those contracts and get those people trained or get the infrastructure ready. But you could only do that if you either were on cloud already or you got on the cruise leaf, I call it. So it is important for companies to face this digital transformation journey in a much accelerated fashion because of COVID-19. They can handle these spikes that are coming, and in fact, when COVID goes away, suddenly you realize that you don't need all that capacity, all that power, or all that network bandwidth, and suddenly you have to reduce the requirements for your infrastructure and your applications and the workload that you were anticipating. So again, cloud would play a very key role if you were there. For example, Accenture, 90% of Accenture's infrastructure runs on public cloud today. And we were able to mobilize and capitalize on that because when COVID-19 hit, we were able to get all our people working remotely, all our applications were ready and available on the cloud, and we didn't see a difference in how we operated before versus how we operating during COVID-19.
Thank you, Sandeep. We have a good end user who can give us an in-depth idea of how they are dealing with this. NTUC Enterprise, Mr. Ramesh.
Thank you. So from my perspective, I think like Sandeep was saying, I feel that people have been using this term digital transformation for quite some time, and a number of my fellow CIOs that I've met with in the last few years have various definitions of what digital transformation means. Cloud certainly plays a key role, but I think in my view, that is a pretty small component of the overall digital transformation. Having been doing digital transformation for more than a decade now, I feel the biggest challenge in driving automation in any enterprise, especially a multi-industry enterprise like NTUC, or prior to this, I was the group CIO for International SOS, where we had presence in about 90 plus countries. And we had a large medical assistance and security assistance company. The challenges associated with digital transformation was oftentimes very less with the technology portion and more so with the cultural mindset change that you really need to drive. The other challenge that I also find with a lot of people is they spend way too much time discussing about technology and not spending enough time defining the business problem up front, right? So my advice would be to say, okay, spend quite a lot of time defining what problem are you really trying to solve? Is there a problem, first of all? Or is it more of a process issue? And secondly, then focus on the technology solution, and then spend an incredible amount of time in the change management and adoption. And that's where I feel that the front and the back portions of this digital transformation, the problem definition portion and the adoption and change management, are the hardest portions. The technology, fortunately, is the easier part. What I also feel is that digital transformation is also about attempting to create new business models and alternate channels of revenue for the company, right? So for us, the alternative business model was the Fair Price Online, which is obviously the e-commerce channel to our brick and mortar store. What's interesting is that Fair Price Online has been around for quite some time now, but most people didn't even know that it existed till COVID-19 happened. And suddenly there has been a increased usage of Fair Price Online, and it has reached levels that we were not expecting anytime soon. Fortunately, we were on a scalable cloud infrastructure, so this allowed us to stay resilient and as best as we could in this times of crisis. And allowed people to shop as many toilet rolls as they want, but other than that, it's been fairly resilient. We could not really control the aspects of people still going in every time Prime Minister comes on TV, the panic buying and people rushing to empty their store shelves. That behavior you can't really change. And that still continues. Even yesterday, when the initial speech happened, the same panic happened again. But what you can drive is a cultural mindset of the people, and how they use technology and so forth. So so I would stop with that, saying that it is a key driver, but don't focus so much on the infrastructure and the cloud. Try to spend more time in the front and the back end of the problem.
Yeah, that brought a very important point, which is skill sets, and the new skill sets that COVID is forcing down on not just companies, but on people as well, including users. All the users have to go online to buy whatever they need. So specifically, my next question is, what cloud skills do enterprises need to sustain beyond COVID-19? I'm going to ask two experts, one from Big Blue and the other from Big G. First, from Big Blue, IBM, Mr. Guna.
Hi, Raju. So we all understand this term, right? It's all the same, but not the same. So the skills when it comes to moving to cloud is like that. The core skills, networking, security, database, middleware, they're all the same, right? Everything that you do now on your on-premise applications, whether you're using virtual machines, the network, your firewall, is all effectively the same. But when you start deploying the same platform on the cloud, you realize that everything is more flexible. Everything is more of a component. So it's not you don't get a full application, and therefore you get everything in chunks. So when you get everything there as a component, or then you're trying to understand and use the flexibility that's available in the cloud. So you need to apply the same knowledge, but in a different context, right? This is like about understanding the architecture of the cloud is important. So last time when you built your data center, you really focus on, you know what, I've got a building. I've got to make sure that my building is safe. On the ground floor, I put a security in it. But when you start doing things in the cloud, everything is actually simpler But because everything is a component, literally every room as a window, and you need to look at how do I make sure that from a room perspective, my infrastructure perspective, all of this is connected, or I take all of that into consideration. So it is the same skills, but like I said, it's more about making sure that you understand the cloud flavor in it. And from a learning perspective, this is a great opportunity. Right? At this moment now, because of COVID-19, whether you look at SkillsFuture or whether you're looking at any form of online certifications from either IBM, Google, any of the cloud providers, all of the certifications are typically made available free. All right, so there are multiple courses and certifications. So if you're stuck at home, you have the opportunity now to go and get the certifications. And on top of the certification, there's also a large ecosystem. So companies like IBM, Accenture, Singtel can all help you. So if you are really looking at, I do need to move to the cloud and I do need help, there are a lot of organizations in Singapore that can help you. So you can help yourself get certifications. And like I said, all of them are available and free at the moment. Or you can work with organizations in Singapore that can actually help you in this transition as well. So yes, skills are important, but they're not unsurmountable difficulties. Raju?
Thank you, Guna. That was a good answer from Big Blue. Now let's go to Big G, Google, Mr. Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Raju. First and foremost, I think I wholeheartedly agree with Guna and sort of where he's coming from. I think if now is, in the work from home environment, a good time to learn, you really should be learning as many of these things, especially from a cloud perspective, as possible. If I can add on though, actually what I would expand is really that I think not only do IT practitioners such as, who we have here today, but also everyone else, especially here in Singapore, can definitely benefit from, at the very least, a basic understanding of what the cloud is, how the technology operates, and how it's impacting people's lives. There's a lot of discussions earlier around security. I think this is a massive implication over there. Just to use a sort of funny anecdote and not, in the vein of trying to throw anyone under the bus, years ago, I was, when the cloud was kind of first getting started in Southeast Asia, I was in a country outside Singapore talking to one of the government agencies. And, I remember we had a really deep discussion about the cloud, about technologies and applications on the cloud. And, they were really coming from a standpoint of saying that, hey, we don't really know, we don't really trust if the cloud security is as good as the security that, they quote unquote have. And I just remember, again, 60, 75-minute discussion about security. And as I was ending the meeting, and, we were doing the card exchange, I was given a card, and their card, again, this is it's a government agency. On the card, the email was at yahoo.com email address. And so I was scratching my head at the point of time, and I was thinking, okay, clearly they take security very seriously in regard to the cloud, but when they think about what they actually use day in, day out, how do they do their data classification and their data governance, and how do they actually implement security in their existing systems, there's generally a little bit of a disparity between sort of what they're hearing and what they're actually implementing. So again, adding on to Guna, I think now is a really good time for everybody, literally everybody, to get a good baseline understanding of technology, of cloud, how it operates, because, like Dr. Anton has mentioned before, this technology is extraordinarily useful now, and it's, I think, only going to be even more prevalent going forward.
Thank you, Brian. That was very insightful, especially your story, where we have contradictory issues about security in the cloud, despite people using the cloud all the time. So we may have come to the end of this interesting discussion, but I still have one last question for all the panelists. I would like each one of you to give me short, actionable tips, 1 minute or less, on key issues that bother everyone. First, on dealing with malware, Mr. Lok.
Thanks, Raju. During this period, we all don't want to be immobilized by ransomware, yeah? So we need to prevent threat vectors, secure the attack surface. For a start, you may want to check out sites like BitSite that gives an overall score of your organization's current security posture. And they do give details on any potential exposure to malware or botnets, right? Just a snapshot. Secondly, have a secure access strategy for your staff devices. If you haven't got one, especially the SMEs, right? There's cloud-based SASE solutions. SASE stands for Secure Access Service Edge. or even deploy MDM. These are quick to deploy, doesn't really need additional hardware. You may want to go to IMDA website. There's security SaaS solutions there. Some are even funded under PSG. Thirdly, get an endpoint protection service or even consider endpoint detect and response solution. Besides protecting, you want to be able to detect and respond to any attacks. Fourth, have a proper backup. Last but not least, again, the weakest link, educate staff on phishing email or even SMS messages, yeah? No public Wi-Fi and change their home router password. Thank you. Over back to you, Raju.
Thank you, Mr. Lok. Second, service level agreements. Do enterprises need to revisit them, Mr. Sandeep?
Absolutely. I think, first of all, this is the time when SLAs get tested, right? The response time, the resolution time, availability, all of these things are come under SLAs. And most of the time when we talk about SLAs, they generally look backwards, which is how is my infrastructure, my network, my cloud, or my outsourcing partner delivering those SLAs. And I think what I would suggest is, of course, you will have to think about what SLAs you may revise with the providers to your enterprise, but also look at the SLA that you've promised to your end users and customers. At this time, you also have to think about what are the SLAs that you may have to rebalance with your end users and your customers, because the end user who was picking up the phone and calling you is not going to pick up the phone and call you because they know that they may not get a representative on the phone. So what is your SLA for alternate channels? Set up the SLA for email, set up the SLA for a live chat, set up an SLA for an Autobot that you would have developed. That's one. And also, if you're in the business of delivering product, or then what is the SLA for you to for your end customers to think about when and how they will get the information, how the delivery will happen, when the delivery will happen. So it is time to reset SLAs. It may sound that you're pushing back, but that's the reality. And you should not only set up the reset or reestablish the SLAs with your backend providers, but also reset some of the expectations in the SLAs with your customer or the end user.
Thank you, Mr. Sandeep. Third, workload migration between clouds. Should enterprise do it or shouldn't they do it? Mr. Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Raju. I mean, I think relatively straightforward question here and kind of a straightforward answer from me. I think number one, absolutely, given the situation we are in now with COVID and obviously the rapid digitization, now is actually a really good time to do workload migration, whether it's between clouds, whether it's from on-premise to the cloud. But the caveat that I would put forward there is that if you are going to do something of such a scale, it's really important to have a simple yet actionable plan, right? We need to be clear, why are you moving clouds? Are you gaining resilience? Are you gaining security versus what you had previously? Are there new business capabilities you didn't have before? The tools you need to do it, the effort you need to do it. The big one, which I usually get day to day, is moving cloud going to be cheaper, right? These are sort of the obvious benefits. Maybe to hopefully help it make a little bit real, I think where I've also personally seen a lot of discussion about workload migration from cloud vendor A to cloud vendor B is actually less about infrastructure, but also more about the ecosystem that it does entail. As an example, from a Google standpoint, whether our customers are working with us to have applications on Android, on Google Play, they use YouTube, they use a tremendous amount of Google Ads, Google Maps, G Suite, and then of course cloud. These are great reasons for very large, far-reaching organizations to so-called move to Google because they use the entire ecosystem. That being said, of course, Google's ecosystem isn't the only ecosystem, and I do, of course, want to try and be fair. For example, other organizations are developing heavily on .NET, and they are going to continue developing on .NET. They use Office 365. They may potentially have using Active Directory as their primary directory service for their suite of applications. And so for many other good reasons, other cloud providers may say, hey, this is where we're going to move to because the ecosystem makes sense to us.
Thank you, Brian. Fourth, public, private, or hybrid clouds. Mr. Guna.
Raju, I think there's not going to be a choice between a public, private, or hybrid. I think every customer is going to have a mix of both or multiple. In fact, I think it's going to be a hybrid multi-cloud. Like what Brian said, everyone's going to be using Gmail, everyone's going to be using Zoom, everyone's going to be using maybe Workday or SAP. Everything is going to be in a multiple cloud. It's not going to have a single cloud platform. Will it be all on public cloud? Not likely. Most customers would have something on private, which is your on-premise, and something on the public cloud. And depending on what's cheaper or your preference for certain tools or applications sit on one particular cloud, you would put something on AWS, something on Google, something on Azure, or even something on IBM Cloud. So you would have actually a combined environment. So the key thing to consider here is that one, when whatever technology that you use, work with in a way the lowest common denominator if you can help it. Go cloud native, put things on containers, run things like OpenShift, so that you can deploy applications on your premise on OpenShift, or by the same time move things to cloud very easily. At this moment, you want to scale up because you need to ramp up quickly, move things to public cloud on any cloud provider, and then as long as you keep it on a container platform or you put it on a open platform, it's very easy for you to move between cloud platforms, right? So you can put things on Google now and then move to IBM or vice versa. That flexibility is important. So it will not be one answer. It will basically be multiple hybrid cloud kind of environment.
Thank you, Guna. Finally, last word for the end user. Between security and latency, enterprises should give more priority to which one? Mr. Ramesh.
So I feel that it's about achieving the right balance. It's not one versus the other. Organizations should make sure that upfront they define the security posture of what is the right posture for the business that they are in. So obviously a retailer may not want to have the same level as a bank, for example, right? Or vice versa. So you need to make sure that your security posture is defined up front. You understand what you are willing to compromise, and then agree upon the risk associated with each one of them. Second is, I think we need to make sure that you define appropriate security policies up front and ensure that you have the right technology to enforce the security policies that you have defined. Third is, I would say that make security integral to your entire life cycle. Security was in the past perceived as a blocker and as someone who slowed things down. Now with the design of having security by design, privacy by design, and having this concept of moving from DevOps to DevSecOps, where the barriers between the three different organizations, which in the past were three different organizations, like development, security, and operations, now all of them are coming together and working on the problem. Finally, I would say that the weakest link is still the human error, and you need to make sure that you conduct appropriate training and making sure that the appropriate efforts has been made to make sure that people don't phish and so forth. And there is a adequate importance and focus given to that particular area. So I would say finally that it's about the balance. Make sure that you pick what is right for your organization, and then back it up with the right technology.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ramesh. That brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you, panelists, Mr. Ramesh from NTUC Enterprise, Mr. Sandeep from Accenture, Mr. Lok from Singtel, Mr. Brian from Google, Mr. Guna from IBM, and Dr. Anton, Honorary President of the SCS Cloud Chapter. And most importantly, to all of you, dear viewers and participants, for joining us for this online event. SCS has a series of such webinars. You can visit www.scs.org.sg to find out more. Until next time, keep healthy, keep safe, and keep a social distance. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thanks, Raju.